There were 8 men who had been shot through the head and chest, most of them with either their hands or feet bound behind them, wearing civilian clothing.
Tell us about that trip to Bucha. Just explain what you saw.
Yeah, so we obviously have been trying to visit each area that's been liberated by the Ukrainians from the Russians as they've pushed them back. And yesterday we arrived in Bucha, having heard these reports of of bodies lying in the streets. Which has happened in other places because obviously people have been killed in crossfire. What was different about these reports was that many of those bodies that were found had their hands tied behind their backs and had been killed by shots, not by any crossfire or shelling. By the time we arrived in Bucha, the town was trying to clear up and had officials took us to a mass grave behind a church, St Andrew's Church, where they had dug a trench and they were bringing the bodies for mass burial, simply just to try and clear them. Some of those were in zip-up body bags, and others had just been thrown in there with unshrouded. But further off from the streets, there are more and more as the soldiers move through the houses and all the kind of sprawling buildings of Bucha. They're just finding one atrocity after another. So one of the sites we went to was a building, commercial building that had been occupied by Russian troops who'd used it as a base. It had a basement, and there was lots of Russian kit and ration packs lying around. And behind the back of that building, there were 8 men who had been shot through the head and chest, most of them with either their hands or feet bound behind them, wearing civilian clothing. And all of their shoes had been removed, which I assume means they were stolen. Again, another place we went to with police, which they were checking for explosives, was a children's recreation ground that had dormitories in it, so children would go there for summer camps. And they were going through one by one, clearing the rooms to check there was no soldiers or explosives there. And in a basement there, they came across 5 men again who'd been just killed execution style, lying in the basement, who apparently had been killed by Russian troops as they left the town. And one of the things they were checking for, because they found it in the neighbouring town Irpin, which was reclaimed by Ukrainian troops just before Bucha, was that some of the bodies had been rigged with explosives to catch anyone who was trying to remove them, because obviously it's the first thing you do when you go into a town like that after fighting, is try and remove the bodies. So they were very gingerly saying, move back while we check that there's no explosives. And in terms of trying to piece together what exactly happened to some of these people, I mean, one of the indicators we got was from a civilian, Vladimir, who seemed very kind of shaken by what happened over the last month, who described having been stopped, interrogated and stripped by Russian soldiers who were looking for evidence of like nationalist tattoos on his body, anything that showed that he was a Ukrainian nationalist or indeed a Nazi, which really the Russians use kind of interchangeably. And he was okay because he didn't have any. But one of the men that we found at the first site, who was lying face down with his hands tied behind his back with plastic tape, had a distinctive tattoo on his back that was presumably spelled a death sentence for him.
They're reporting them to us and for the Times. We're also joined this morning by Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasilenko. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make of what's happened in Bucha? Have you spoken to people there? What's your assessment?
I have been online yesterday all day and for most of the night with people from there, with colleagues, with friends who had houses there, who who had their whole lives there. And I mean, it's devastating. Most of the people who I know are young professionals, Ukrainians who have saved up for their whole life and started their families and moved to Bucha, to Irpin, to all of these smaller towns and villages around Kiev, because it's comfortable to get to work there, but it's also very comfortable for kids to grow up there. And sorry, I have to actually get to different meetings. I'm walking as I talk. But yeah, it's basically what we are witnessing is just complete atrocities that are happening, and the houses of these people who have, who have their whole life destroyed there, who have been saving up for a quiet, calm life with their families, and who essentially now have to rebuild everything from scratch. But God knows how, because they have also lost their jobs because of this war, and they have also no savings whatsoever. And this is just about material things. I'm not going to, the question you asked is not about people's lives, but what the images that are coming from Bucha. They're just heartbreaking.
We may just have lost her. She's being moved around a place where she's at the minute. That's the MP, Lesia Vasilenko, talking about. It's actually really important to have this notion that we regard these places that you just see the name, Bucha, I have no knowledge of what it's about, but it's a suburban commuter town. It's a place that in, what was it, 7 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, would have been a place full of young professionals and people who've lived there for a long time, getting on with one another, going into Kyiv for work and coming back again, and very normal, boring, even suburban life.
And socialising and going to restaurants and seeing their mates and just having a normal life. And instead, they're now walking down the streets, having been kept inside for 3 weeks. And it really struck me when I asked Catherine Philp, who went to Bucha yesterday, and I asked her about how these people were coping who live there when they came out in the streets. And she said, as shocking as it is for them to walk past dead bodies, they haven't had any food. They need to go and get food. This is a struggle for survival. And it's just really terrifying how quickly things can change in the course of just a few weeks in Europe. Yeah,
and you see, and they say we keep talking about this picture, but it's well worth the picture. Seeing the picture, you get this sense of a wrecked town or city of Bucha, but these dead bodies just lying in the middle of the street. But what Catherine Philp was explaining to us, she went to other places where she saw executions. So some of these dead bodies that we see in the street, we spoke to another journalist. There was one of them had their hands tied and had probably been executed therefore. But Catherine had been to see a whole bunch of people in basements where there's been no shelling, there's no accidental shrapnel, there's no collateral damage. This is people having their shoes taken, their hands and feet bound, and getting shot in the chest and the head. And you could hear it in Catherine's voice. I felt that there's this sort of anger, and then the Russian response, which we're kind of half reporting, because it becomes a point where there's no point in reporting what Russia has to say because it's so self-evidently ridiculous. We've got a journalist there on the ground looking at corpses, and Russia's saying it's staged for the Western media and is not real. But we know that it's real because we can actually see it. We can speak to someone who has seen it, and we've seen pictures. In the 21st century, it's very hard to conceal this type of stuff, isn't it? Because there's satellite image. One of the stories in the Times today talks about satellite imagery. You can see what's going on from the air. You can talk to people. You've got people who've got videos. People have got phones. It's very hard to conceal much of this.
And it's not a single journalist who's gone and seen this. Lots of journalists are now making their way and seeing that and verifying what is happening. And for Catherine to talk about, when I asked her about the Russian response, and for her to say, I have covered many conflicts, many wars, and I have never before seen people with their arms and hands and feet bound and gunshots to the back of the head or the neck. I think it's quite telling about the nature of this invasion.
And the question, I suppose, that follows, which is the one we put to Simon Hart, among other things, that the Welsh Secretary, is what do we need to do more of then? Because we heard on Times Radio yesterday that there was this bid to have tanks, and I think the Foreign Minister for Ukraine said tanks are coming. Tanks are coming. I can't say any more of that, but tanks are coming. Should we be providing tanks for Ukraine? I can't really see the distinction between anti-tank missiles and tanks, because I know that there's a line somewhere where they feel that if you provide too much equipment, too much aggressive equipment, you cross into engagement with Russia. But it feels a very dubious distinction at the moment, don't you think, with what we're seeing?
That was the point that Simon Hart made, wasn't it, the Welsh Secretary, when he spoke to you an hour or so ago. He was talking about the fact that it has to be defensive arms that they are giving. so anti-tank missiles, which they're giving at the moment to Ukraine, whereas he wasn't prepared to be drawn on whether tanks were being sent. But also it's the interesting point as well that we know that Odessa is now looking like the next place that the Russians are going to target. And it's not going to be anti-tank missiles they need there. It's going to be coming from the sea. It's ships. So people are saying there, we need the kind of arms that can stop a ship. And that is going to be the challenge. Are European governments, are NATO governments going to be willing to give that sort of armoury to help Ukraine?
And the UK government might, but will the German government and will the French government? Because it's got to be all, Lucy Fisher was telling us, it's got to be all 30 countries united together. We'll carry on discussing what's going on in Ukraine with people who've seen the evidence for their eyes. It's important to document what's actually happening rather than what perhaps Vladimir Putin would like to pretend is happening. It's now 8:20. You're listening to Times Radio Breakfast.